December 19th, 1944. 10:30 at night. A crossroads in the Bois de Herbemont, 8 miles northwest of Bastogne, Belgium. The shooting has stopped. It lasted about 15 minutes, and now the only sound is the fire. 6 vehicles are burning at the junction, and the light they throw is bright enough to read by. It falls on rows of canvas tents. It falls on the red crosses painted across those tents, which nobody could see through the fog an hour ago, and which every man here can see now. A man is walking toward the German officer standing in that light. He is not carrying a weapon. Nobody in this field is. He turned 32 years old today. His name is Charles Van Gorder, a surgeon with the 3rd Auxiliary Surgical Group, attached to the 101st Airborne Division's clearing station. He grew up around Pennsylvania Dutch German, and that accident of childhood is the only tool he has left. So he uses it. He calls out to the officer, in the officer's own language, what the man is actually looking at. Medical troops. Unarmed. A hospital. Behind him, tracers have already come through the canvas of the evacuation tent, and the wounded on the litters were hit a second time where they lay. Aidmen went down on top of them. That is not a figure of speech. They lowered screaming casualties onto the ground and covered them with their own bodies. Down at the crossroads, inside the burning trucks, men are still alive and calling out. A technician named Emile Natal hears it. He runs to Van Gorder, and Van Gorder, in the middle of an argument with an armed man who holds every advantage, breaks off long enough to tell him to go and try. A German soldier is sent along with him. The two of them run down the slope together, an American and a German, and the heat settles it before they can get near. They look at each other. They shake their heads. They turn their backs and walk away. Natali wrote afterward that the voices from those trucks stayed with him the rest of his life. 30 minutes. That is what the German commander allows. 30 minutes to load every doctor, every technician, and every crate of equipment onto whatever still runs, and drive east into German lines. If the story of America's medical men in this war is worth your time, a like and a subscribe help this channel reach the people still searching for it. It takes a second. It matters. 11 officers and 119 enlisted men of the 326th Airborne Medical Company went into captivity that night. Add the division surgeon's office. Add Van Gorder's team. 142 Americans, and nearly every one of them trained for nothing in this world except keeping other men alive. Hold on to that number, because of what it meant 12 hours later. The 101st Airborne was about to be encircled at Bastogne, and it had just lost the only place inside that ring where a man with a torn open abdomen could be put on a table. But the siege has been told 1,000 times. What happened to those 142 men after the trucks turned east has not. Because a captured doctor was not a prisoner in the ordinary sense, and both armies knew it. Under the Geneva Convention, he was a separate category, not to be put behind wire and forgotten, but kept where the wounded were and made to work. And here is where it turns strange. The wounded waiting for them were not always American. All that winter, in convents and school cellars and farmhouses on the German side of the line, American surgeons found themselves working on German soldiers. Not as a gesture, simply because those were the men bleeding in front of them, and a surgeon beside a bleeding man does the one thing he knows how to do. And standing across those tables, close enough to touch, were German military doctors, watching. That is the question this film answers, and I want you to carry it for the next hour. What did those German doctors see? Not technically. What did they understand, standing in that room, about the war they were fighting and the country that had sent them? One warning, so you can measure the answer when it comes. It is not penicillin, and it is not blood, though both come into this. If it were only about supplies, this would be a shorter story and a far less disturbing one. The beginning of it is a few hours earlier and 12 miles east. The town is Wiltz in northern Luxembourg. On the morning of that same 19th of December, machine gun fire came up the streets toward a convent where a platoon of the 42nd Field Hospital had taken its wounded into the cellar. Shelling of the river bridge the night before had blown out every window in the building. Major Henry Huber, the hospital commander, tore up a bedsheet, walked outside, and started up the road toward the German paratroopers coming down it. They shot at him. An American uniform is an American uniform. When they worked out what he was, they lined his men up in the courtyard and went through their pockets for cigarettes and knives. Then they stopped in front of one American officer, looked at him a moment longer than the others, and said one word. They took him out of the line and marched him away. Every man left standing in that courtyard was certain he knew where that officer was going. They were wrong. What happened to Captain Harry Fisher over the following week is one of the strangest things in any of these records, and we will get to it. But first, the convent. The Germans were not passing through Wiltz. They were moving in. A German medical company, 5 officers and 50 men, set up its own clearing station in that same building, and the two of them worked side by side for 8 days. And on the second day, the Germans opened their instrument cases. Major Charles Serbst, the senior American surgeon in that cellar, looked at what came out, and one thing did not belong. Everything the Germans carried was worn, improvised, cheap. Everything except a single instrument, which was clean, sharp, and gleaming, and which they reached for more often than anything else they owned. When Serbst finally asked why, the answer told him more about how Germany was fighting this war than any intelligence briefing he had ever sat through. Here is the thing you need to know about Charles Serbst before you watch him ask that question. The night before the Germans came, when the trucks arrived to pull the hospital out of Wiltz, there were more than 20 men in that building whose wounds meant that under American regulations, they could not be moved at all. The rules were clear. You do not put a man with a fresh abdominal wound onto a truck bed on a frozen road. Serbst argued to move them anyway. His reasoning, recorded at the time, tells you what kind of man was about to walk into that cellar. He believed the truck ride would be dangerous. He believed German captivity would be more dangerous. He lost the argument. The trucks went out with the walking wounded and the nurses. Serbst stayed, with Major Henry Huber and one other medical officer, and the men who could not be lifted. And by morning, the decision had been made for all of them. 20th of December, 1944. The convent at Wiltz, cellar level. No glass in any window above them. The wounded lying on the stone floor. Upstairs, the Germans are unpacking. The officers had been friendly enough when they arrived. They had also, within the hour, taken possession of every American medical supply in the building. Sit with that a moment. A German field medical unit had just captured an American hospital, and the first thing it did was inventory the American drugs, because it needed them. Then they laid out their own equipment, and the Americans got their first close look at what the German army was actually working with in the 5th year of the war. Paper bandages. Not gauze, paper, a crepe-like material used as a substitute. Crude instruments, sterilizers that had been improvised out of whatever was available. And one instrument that did not match any of it. Clean, sharp, new. It was an amputation knife. An amputation knife in a field hospital is not remarkable. Every army had them. What the Americans could not stop watching was how often the Germans reached for it, and how fast they used it. The phrase in the record is that German surgeons took off an arm or a leg with about as much deliberation as an American surgeon would use to lance a boil. Serbst finally asked, not as an accusation, as one professional to another, in a building where they were both losing patients. The answer came back in 3 sentences. The third is the one that matters. We do not have the time or the money for tedious and expensive reconstructive surgery. A man with a stump can be discharged in a few weeks. A man in a plaster cast uses up a hospital bed for months. Read that last line again. A man in a plaster cast uses up a hospital bed for months. That is not a medical statement. There is no anatomy in it, nothing about the patient at all. It is an accounting statement. The German surgeon was not describing a wound. He was describing a cost. And the cost he was measuring was not the cost to the soldier. It was the cost to the system that owned him. And notice what he was not doing. He was not defending himself. He was explaining obvious arithmetic to a foreign colleague who, in his view, had simply not run the numbers. Hold on to that, because the whole story turns on it. The German doctor thought the American was naive. By that measure, he had a point. Because down in that cellar, the Americans were doing something that made no arithmetic sense whatsoever. They had no heat. The supplies they had brought were being consumed and not replaced. Wounded kept arriving through the German lines, some of them American. And among the men who came in, a number died for one specific reason that appears again and again in these records. They died from lack of blood. Not from their wounds, from the absence of the one thing that would have carried them through the wound. And the American surgeons, who had spent 2 years in an army that could put blood into a man within an hour of him being hit, sat in a Luxembourg basement in the dark and watched that happen, and kept working anyway. On men they knew they were going to lose. On men whose beds, by the arithmetic upstairs, should have been cleared. That is the split. 2 medical services, 1 building, 8 days, and a difference between them that has nothing to do with equipment. Keep it in your pocket. We come back to it with evidence that makes it far darker than a disagreement between 2 surgeons. On Christmas Eve, the Germans sent a few bottles of wine down to the cellar. It was, by every account, a genuine gesture. The Americans decided to give it to the casualties. They were still dividing it up when 4 shells came into the courtyard in quick succession. Falling beams and flying glass injured 4 Americans. German losses in the same barrage were heavier. Nobody in that building on either side was safe from the same shell. Remember that. It matters later, when we ask whether any of this was about cruelty. On the 27th of December, with the front collapsing back toward them, the Germans decided to pull out and take everyone with them. 80 American casualties were carried up out of the cellar. At least half of them were men who could not be moved. They went onto open trucks, in the cold, for a long drive into Germany, because leaving them was worse. Huber stood in the courtyard supervising the loading, with a German medical officer watching him do it. And while he stood there, an American intelligence sergeant named Lester Koritz came up beside him and quietly said he was going to run. Huber did not talk him out of it. He wished him luck. Minutes later, the trucks pulled out for Germany, and Koritz went down a steep path into Witz and vanished into the houses of Luxembourgers who kept him alive until the Americans came back in January. So that is Witz. One American doctor now understood the equation the German army was using, but he had only heard it described. Nobody had yet watched that system run at full speed, from the inside, with a battle going on around it. Except that somebody had. 3 miles from Bastogne, the officer they had marched out of that courtyard was still alive, and the Germans had just given him a job. They did not take Captain Harry Fisher into the woods. They took him to a motor pool, 19th of December, 1944, somewhere behind the German advance west of Wiltz. A German officer asked him whether he could drive an ambulance. Fisher pointed out that he was a surgeon. He was told to do as he was told. Sit inside that moment for a second, because it is one of the strangest things in this story. An army had just pulled an American officer out of a line of prisoners for one reason, a reason that, in that army, in that year, usually ended in a ditch. And then the same army looked at him, decided it needed him, and put him to work on its own wounded. They gave him a German orderly and attached him to a divisional clearing station. The division was Panzer Lehr, the formation whose job that week was to take Bastogne. So Harry Fisher marched out of that courtyard under a sentence everybody assumed was death. Spent the next several days inside the German army, watching it fight from a place almost no Allied officer of the war ever saw. Which gives us something the histories almost never have: an American doctor sitting inside the German medical service at its peak effort in the middle of Germany's last great offensive. Pay attention to what he saw. It is the second piece of the answer. The station set up on high ground above a village called Woerden, on the road running between Wiltz and Bastogne, and from there, Fisher could look down and watch a battle begin underneath him. German tanks and an armored infantry battalion went into Woerden. Waiting for them was one company of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Understand what that means. Paratroopers who had come into this fight off the back of trucks 3 days earlier, holding a village against armor with essentially nothing to shoot at a tank with. There was no equipment answer available to those men. There was only the decision to stay in the village. They lost the village. It cost the company terribly. But look at the German timetable that evening. Panzer Lehr's men were too used up to go on to the next village that night. Bastogne got another night to dig, and a few miles away, another set of American medics got another night to move wounded. And it was bought by a rifle company that had no business surviving the afternoon. Then the price arrived at Fisher's basement. He counted more than 100 casualties that he saw with his own hands, and he knew there were more he never saw at all. American paratroopers from that company, wounded and now prisoners like him. He worked in a small Belgian cellar, barely bigger than a farm kitchen. And here is the detail I need you to hold on to, because it will come back with force later. Most of those casualties could not fit inside. They lay outside, in the rain, in December, waiting. That is not an accusation against any particular German doctor in that building. There was no room. There was no transport. Every one of those men was inside a system that had already decided how much it could afford to spend on him. And the answer was written into the shortage itself. Now put an American aid station beside it. Same month, same weather, same shelling. In an American division that winter, most wounded men reached a clearing station or a field hospital surgical team within an hour or two of being hit, because the whole chain from the foxhole backward had been motorized down to the jeep that came to the man where he lay. Two systems. Same rain. Fisher's night in that cellar ended the way it had to end. American artillery began ranging onto the position. The Germans decided to move, fast. They left most of the casualties behind. Fisher described it afterward without drama, and it is one of the most brutal lines in the record. They left them. He went. He was a prisoner, and prisoners do not decide. On the 20th of December, the clearing station moved forward into what was left of Woerden, 2 miles closer to Bastogne. And from there, Fisher watched the German attack go in against the next village, Marvy. He watched it fail. German half-tracks got into the streets. The village stayed American. And as long as it stayed American, the road into Bastogne stayed shut. Then came the 23rd. For a week, the Ardennes had been sealed under fog, which was exactly what the German plan required. On the morning of the 23rd, the weather over the whole route from England to Belgium simply opened. Fisher was standing on a hillside inside the German army when it happened. 241 aircraft came in over Bastogne that day, each one carrying around 1,200 pounds. 160 more came the next day. Put that into something you can see. Cargo parachutes in the hundreds, coming down over a surrounded town in daylight, in full view of the German units supposed to be strangling it. Civilians in Bastogne came up out of their cellars to stand in the street and stare at the sky. The phrase that survives from the town is that these Americans seemed like people from another world. And on the German side of the ring, an American surgeon in captivity looked up at the same parachutes and said it was the most thrilling thing he had ever seen. He was not the only man on that hillside watching. Every German doctor and orderly at that clearing station was standing in the open, looking at the same sky, doing the same arithmetic that Harry Fisher was doing. Because those bundles were not only ammunition, blankets, litters, plasma, Vaseline gauze, sterilizers, distilled water. The recovery rate on the medical drop of the 24th of December was 100%. Every man on that hill understood it. An army that could not reach its encircled division by road had reached it by air, and had spent its aircraft on stretchers and bandages. Now, inside the ring, the men on the receiving end of that drop kept a ledger of everyone they treated during the siege. 943 Americans. And one more figure, in the same ledger, in the same handwriting, that had nothing to do with Americans at all. 125 Germans. That is the other number in the Bastogne ledger. 943 Americans and 125 enemy wounded treated inside the ring during the siege, by the same exhausted men, out of the same supply that was running out. Before you decide how you feel about that, look at what those supplies actually were on the day the ring closed. 21st of December, 1944, Bastogne. The division has no clearing company. It was taken at the crossroads 2 nights ago, along with its surgeons. So Major Martin Wisely, surgeon of the 327th Glider Infantry, is handed a job that in any normal week would be absurd. Build a hospital. Out of what? Out of the doctors nobody could spare. The artillery surgeon, the anti-aircraft surgeon, the medical officers of the engineer battalion, and the attached tank destroyer battalion. Men who were not trauma surgeons and had never claimed to be. They opened in a Belgian army barracks. When the shelling and the bombing became too heavy, they moved down into a basement garage, one very large room and one small room off it. About 150 seriously wounded men lay in the big room on litters and on straw. There was one light. Everyone else, and there were hundreds, was scattered through the cellars of the town. Down on the Rue de Neufchâteau, a battalion surgeon from the 10th Armored Division, named Jack Pryor, had his own aid station. He had come out of the fighting at Noville a few days earlier, and his description of it explains the state these men were in before the siege even started. Head wounds, belly wounds, chest wounds, fractures everywhere. Casualties arriving faster than he could think, his half-track knocked out, no way to send anyone to the rear, and the second story blown off the building while he crawled along the floor between patients. 2 Belgian women volunteered to work with him. Renée Lemaire, a nurse who had come home to visit her parents and been caught by the offensive, and Augusta Chiwi, trained in Leuven, who had been treating civilians with her uncle until she walked into an American aid station and asked what needed doing. Now the supplies. Plasma they had. Whole blood they did not. Most of the containers dropped on the 23rd had broken on impact. Blankets were being collected off frontline troops. Penicillin they had none at all, until 6:30 on the evening of Christmas Day, when a single light aircraft came in under fire and landed with a supply of it. That is the inventory. 1 light bulb, straw on a garage floor, a broken blood supply, and doctors who mostly were not surgeons. And into that, 125 German soldiers. Nobody in Bastogne wrote a speech about it. There is no memo. There is a ledger, kept during a siege, in which enemy wounded are counted in the same column as everyone else, out of the same shrinking stock of plasma, by people who did not know whether they would be alive on the 28th. Understand what that means physically, not morally. Plasma is a finite quantity in a garage. Every unit that went into a German soldier's arm was a unit that was no longer available for the American on the next litter. The men making that decision were not making it in an office. They were making it while the building shook. And this was not a local eccentricity. Across the theater that winter, the American Medical Service applied the same standard of care to captured enemy wounded as to its own, and it did so as a matter of policy, not mood. There is a stranger detail attached to it. By late 1944, a typical 400-bed American evacuation hospital had between 50 and 80 German prisoners or local civilians working on it as attendants and laborers. Read that again. German prisoners of war, inside American hospitals, on the wards, every day, carrying litters and watching American doctors work. Remember that. We are going to need it before this is over. Because it means the observation ran in both directions, and it ran for months. Back to Bastogne and to Christmas Eve, because the town paid for that night. German bombers came over twice. One aid station took a direct hit and collapsed on the men inside it. Volunteers dug through the wreckage for the rest of the night. Renée Lemaire was killed in that building. That morning, she had gone out and recovered a white parachute from one of the supply drops. She had told people what it was for. When the war was over, and she was married, she meant to make a wedding dress out of it. Jack Pryor found her remains himself and carried them back to her parents, wrapped in that parachute. Augusta Chiwi lived. She went on working. She was still working when the corridor opened. And it did open. On Christmas Day, a surgeon named Howard Serrell was flown in by light aircraft and performed 15 surgical procedures in 36 hours. The next afternoon, a glider came in carrying a full surgical team under Major Lamar Suter. They started operating at 6:30 that evening and did not stop until noon the following day. So now, hold the two ledgers side by side. In a convent cellar in Wiltz, a German surgeon explained that a man in a plaster cast occupies a bed for months and reached for the amputation knife. In a garage in Bastogne, men who were not surgeons, working under one light bulb with no blood and no penicillin, spent part of what they had on enemy soldiers and wrote the number down. And now I have to be honest with you, because there is an easy explanation sitting right there, and it is wrong. The easy explanation is that the Americans could afford it, that this is a story about a rich army and a poor one, and that any doctor with plasma and aircraft would have done the same. Here is why that explanation collapses. 5 weeks before Bastogne, in a different forest, 2 American battalion surgeons were trapped behind German lines in a hole in a hillside 18 feet long, with 65 wounded men and no way out at all. The Germans came to them and offered them something. What those 2 men said in reply is the reason we can throw the easy explanation away. 7th of November, 1944. The gorge of the Kahl River in the Hürtgen forest inside Germany. Picture a hole cut into a steep hillside beside a mud track. 18 feet long, 12 feet wide. Cave-like. That is the entire medical facility. Inside it, about 25 wounded men. Outside it, along the track, in the cold and the rain and then the snow, about 40 more. Wrapped in whatever blankets could be found, which was not enough blankets. Standing over them, in the open, are American soldiers holding Red Cross flags up where the Germans can see them, because that is the only roof those men have. 2 doctors are running this. Captain Michael DeMarco, surgeon of the 3rd Battalion of the 112th Infantry, and Captain Pascal Linguidi of the 1st Battalion, whose own aid station in a basement forward at Kammerscheit has just been folded into this one. How they got here is quickly told. Their division pushed 2 battalions across the gorge to take the villages of Schmidt and Kammerscheit, and the counterattacks came in from 3 sides. The only way back was that track. Ambulances could not use it. Knocked-out tanks blocked it. German shelling closed the loading point at the top. So the wounded stopped moving, and they piled up where the trail was. Watch what the 2 surgeons do, because it is a decision, not a reflex. They are short of men. American infantry are coming back through the gorge in 1s and 2s, armed and exhausted, trying to get out. Linguidi and DeMarco stop them, take their weapons off them, and put them to work as litter bearers and orderlies. Think about why the weapons had to come off. An aid station with armed men in it is not an aid station. It is a strong point, and everyone in it can be legally killed. Those two doctors were, in the middle of a disaster, carefully keeping their patch of hillside inside the rules, because the rules were the only cover they had left. And then the Germans came. They came several times, infiltrating behind the trapped battalions, and each time did the same thing. They announced that the medics were now prisoners. They checked that no armed Americans were present. Then they left the aid station alone. They let American walking wounded come down the trail from Kommerscheid and reach the station unmolested. They took the vehicles which they needed, and at one point, a German unit offered Linguidi and DeMarco food and medicine. Now stop and count the position those two men were in. 65 wounded, 25 under cover, 40 in the snow, not enough blankets, cut off, no transport, and an enemy standing in front of them, holding out supplies. They said no. The record does not give us their words or their reasoning. It gives us the answer. They declined. I said last time there was an easy explanation for the way American doctors behaved that winter, that they could afford to be generous. Hold it up against a hole in a hillside where two American surgeons with nothing turned down an enemy's food. Whatever was driving these men, it was not surplus. Here is what makes it certain. When the two battalions finally pulled out of Kommerscheid on the night of the 8th of November, Linguidi and DeMarco stayed where they were, inside German lines, with their patients. And the regimental surgeon, Major Albert Berndt, went to the local German commander with a proposal. Not a proposal to evacuate American wounded. A truce to clear the Kahl Valley of the casualties of both sides. The German commander agreed. Out of it came a scratch convoy of trucks and tracked weasels that carried the doctors, their medical men, the chaplains, and the severely wounded back to American lines. The price was that the lightly wounded and the non-medical personnel stayed behind and went into captivity. Everybody knew what that meant when they agreed to it. Now, the other half of that valley, which is not what a film like this usually shows you. On the German side of the Kahl Bridge that same week, a German medical officer was doing exactly the same thing. His name was Günther Stütgen, a captain and a doctor with the 275th Infantry Division. Between the 7th and the 9th of November, he negotiated a series of short ceasefires at that bridge so the wounded of both armies could be reached and carried out. The ceasefires held. American stretcher parties went down into the ravine and were not fired on. German medics did the same. Wounded Americans who should have died in that gorge were treated by German doctors and lived because of it. After the war, the governor of Pennsylvania honored him. Pennsylvania, because the division bleeding in that valley was Pennsylvania's own National Guard. And a few days later, on the 12th of November, a German lieutenant named Friedrich Lengfeld heard an American calling for help from inside a minefield the Germans had christened the Wild Sow. He went in after him. He was mortally wounded doing it and died the same day. Today, there is a plaque to Lengfeld in a German military cemetery in that forest, and it was put there by American veterans of the 4th Infantry Division. It is the only memorial anywhere to a German soldier placed by the men he fought. So let us be extremely clear about something, because everything from here depends on it. The difference this film is chasing is not a difference in decency. It is not that German doctors were monsters and American doctors were saints. In that forest, in the same week, both sides produced men who risked their lives to get an enemy's wounded out of a ravine. Which forces the question into a much harder shape. If the men were the same, and in the Hurtgen they demonstrably were, then what exactly was it that Charles Zerbst watched happening in that convent cellar? What was Harry Fisher looking at when the casualties were left lying in the rain? 6 months later, A group of American doctors was sent to walk through the wreckage of the German medical system with notebooks and find out. One of them wrote up what he saw on a single ward round and gave the report a title. He called it The Story of a Finger. By the end of that ward round, he would not shake the German surgeon's hand. May 1945, northern Italy, days after the German surrender there. A group of American medical officers is driving through captured German hospitals with notebooks. The 5th Army surgeon has sent them. They are not clerks. Among them are Colonel Howard Snyder, the Army's surgical consultant, Colonel Eldridge Campbell, a neurosurgeon, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Sanger, Chief of Surgery at an evacuation hospital. Their job is to find out how the other side had been practicing medicine. Before I tell you what they found, here is the warning they gave themselves, because it stands at the front of their own report. They wrote that no honest observer can judge German medicine in 1939 by what is lying on the floor in 1945. What they were walking through was a defeated army in collapse. They knew it. Keep that in mind for everything that follows, and then watch what happens anyway. One of them writes up a single ward round. He gives it a title, The Story of a Finger. It begins ordinarily. A German surgeon is making rounds. He looks at charts and films. He examines limbs, handling the soiled bandages barehanded, adjusting traction frames, opening a few wounds on the ward to look at them. At one bed, he wants to know whether the patient is dehydrated. So he puts his finger, the same unwashed finger, into the man's mouth and draws it across his tongue. He looks at the moisture on it. He wipes the finger on his own coat and remarks that the man is not too dry. The chief of the hospital walks onto the ward. There is a military greeting, and then the two men shake hands. Several cases are taken through to the septic dressing room, and this is where the American stops treating it as a curiosity. 3 tables, a patient on each. Large wounds, all dressings off. Nobody in the room is wearing a mask. People are talking over the open wounds. The door swings and swings. Just outside, a staircase is being dry swept, and the dust from it is drifting through the doorway and into the room. The German surgeon takes down a pus-soaked dressing from a man's limb. Then, without washing his hands and without putting on gloves, he handles the wound underneath it. When he is finished, he lays the used instruments down on the tabletop and moves to the next patient. He does not wash his hands in between. At the end of it, the American walked out of that dressing room without shaking anyone's hand. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn that into a cheap joke, and it is not one. When the Americans asked about it afterward, they got an answer that explained everything they had just watched, and it was not laziness. It was doctrine. The German medical service assumed that any penetrating combat wound would become infected. Not might, would. Pus was expected. It was normal. It was, in their understanding, simply what happened to a shell fragment wound, and the job was to let the infection run and let the wound heal afterward. Now think about what that assumption does to a man in a dressing room. If every wound is going to suppurate anyway, then a clean pair of gloves is a courtesy, not a necessity. The finger, the dust, the unwashed hands, those are not the disease. They are the symptom of a belief. And the belief came from somewhere. There is an operation at the center of this. An Allied surgeon receiving a shell fragment wound in 1944 opened it wide, cut away every scrap of dead and dying tissue, and left it open. Not sewn shut. Open. The wound was closed days later, farther back, when it was clean. It is slow. It is unglamorous. It is the single reason that a generation of American soldiers kept their arms and legs. One of the German surgeons interviewed had performed that operation, properly, 4 or 5 times in as many years of war. Then there is blood. Every German transfusion in that theater was direct, donor to patient, arm to arm, no bank. The amounts were small, 200, 300, 500 cubic centimeters, never more than a liter. Some German surgeons argued against giving more than 300 at a sitting. Plasma the Germans could not get, and there was a rule that followed from it. If the man's pulse had not come back after that, he did not go to surgery. Read that as the sentence it actually is. The more blood a man had lost, the less likely he was to be operated on at all. The Americans could see the result without asking. They wrote down what the wards looked like. Ward after ward of extremely pale men. Now set the American system beside it, as their report does. Plasma held forward in every medical unit of a division. Banked blood in every army hospital, including the field hospital platoons sitting alongside the division clearing stations, minutes from the fighting. Same wound, same hour. One man gets blood where he lies. The other gets 300 cubic centimeters if there is a donor, and if there is not, he gets a blanket. And in the heaviest fighting, the system went further. When casualties came in faster than they could be handled, the men with abdominal wounds and head wounds were set aside and given no surgery at all, in favor of the lightly wounded, who could be patched up and sent back to their units. There it is again. The same arithmetic Charles Zerbst heard in the cellar at Wiltz 5 months earlier and hundreds of miles away, out of the mouth of a completely different German officer. A wounded man's value is his return to duty. If he cannot be returned to duty, he is a cost. That is not triage as a doctor understands it. Triage decides who to treat first. This decides who is worth treating at all. So the Americans put the only question left. How did a country that produced some of the finest medicine on earth end up here? And the German doctors had an answer waiting. They gave it in 5 parts. 4 of those parts were about the war. The first one was not. It had nothing to do with the war at all. It began in Germany in 1933, years before a shot was fired. Here is the first of the 5 reasons, in the words the German doctors gave to the Americans interviewing them in the spring of 1945. There were not enough doctors. And the reason there were not enough doctors was that between 1933 and 1939, large numbers of medical men had been driven out of Germany for reasons that had nothing whatever to do with their practice of medicine. Read the dates again. 1933 to 1939. Not one of those years is a war year. The consequence they described was not dramatic. It was slow and arithmetical. The medical schools lost their teachers. With fewer teachers, fewer physicians graduated, year after year, and the shortfall compounded. Then the war came, and the number of wounded men assigned to each surviving doctor went up and up until the time available for any one of them collapsed. That is reason number 1, and everything else in this film has been standing on top of it without knowing. The other 4 came quickly after. 2. There were simply too many casualties arriving too fast. One German surgeon gave the Americans a comparison from his own hands. Working in Naples in September of 1943, he had been able to treat fresh wounds properly, with a complete excision and a clean closure, and his infection rate was around 4%, as good as his civilian practice had ever been. On the Russian front, he said, an operation that needed an hour had to be finished in less than a minute. In one 3-day stretch there, 1,000 battle casualties came into a field hospital staffed by 2 doctors and no nurses. He knew what he was doing to those men. He said so plainly. There was no other choice available to him. 3. Distance. During the advance on Stalingrad, the German army was moving 40 to 60 kilometers a day, and wounded men were shipped rearward with no initial treatment at all, for days, in Russian winter cold, and many of them arrived frozen or too far gone to survive an anesthetic. In Italy, it was the opposite problem. No movement by daylight at all because of Allied aircraft, so the wounded traveled at night over mountain passes. 4. Supplies. No blood banks, plasma unobtainable, and a phrase that stops you when you see it written down by a doctor about his own service. Penicillin was unknown. 5, and this is the one they seemed to find hardest to say. The deterioration of the medical officers themselves. Morale gone. Doctors who had come to believe that all wounds were infected because all the wounds they saw were infected. No uniform standard of treatment across the service, and no system for spreading what worked. Young surgeons pushed through training too fast, whom one of them called graduate wonders, who did not know the basic principles. Better treatment for the Luftwaffe, the SS, and senior officers than for an infantryman. And senior medical appointments handed out on political grounds rather than professional ones. That is the answer. That is what those German doctors understood, standing a few feet from Americans in a cellar in Luxembourg and on a hillside above Bastogne. They were not looking at a richer army. They were looking at what their own country had done to them, arriving on a stretcher. And now go back to the 19th of December and to a courtyard in Wiltz, and watch it close. A German soldier walks down a line of American prisoners, stops at one officer, looks at him a moment longer than the others, and identifies him as a Jew. He takes him out of the line and marches him away, and every American standing there believes he is being taken off to be shot. Then the German army looks at Harry Fisher, discovers that he is a surgeon, and puts him to work. Because it needs surgeons. Because it does not have enough of them. Because of what it spent the 1930s doing to men exactly like him. I have gone back over that sequence many times and still have no clean word for it. The same policy that pulled him out of the line was the reason he was too valuable to shoot. He treated German soldiers that week. Some of them lived because a man that state had defined as an enemy was standing over them with his hands inside a wound. Now the numbers, because they close it. In the 4 American field armies in Europe, of every 100 battle casualties who reached a medical installation alive, fewer than 3 died. At one general hospital at Liège that received 4,000 surgical patients from the 1st and 9th Armies, the deaths numbered 2. There was 1 case of gas gangrene in those 4,000, and the man recovered. On the other side, a German consultant told the Americans that wound infection in this war had been about as frequent in the German army as it had been in the last one. In one German hospital, 60% of shell fragment wounds of the chest had gone on to empyema. In another, half of all chest wounds. 1944, and the German medical service was getting 1918 results. The Americans put down why, and it was not any single miracle. It was earlier surgery, done properly, by enough people, with blood available forward and antibiotics behind it. A whole chain, and the chain worked because every link had been built. One of those American observers wrote a line I keep coming back to. His reaction to walking through those German wards was not condemnation. It was that seeing the German wounded had given him the contrast he needed to understand what his own medical service had actually achieved. He had needed to see the other system to recognize his own. Which brings us back to the men we started with. Because while those reports were being typed up in Italy, the American doctors taken at Wiltz and at the crossroads outside Bastogne were still out there, somewhere east, in a Germany coming apart. Some of them had been marched into Poland, and when the Red Army finally came through the wire and the gates were open and no one on earth had any authority over them at all, those American surgeons did something that nobody had ordered them to do, and that nobody would ever have blamed them for refusing. They went back to work. That is what the American surgeons taken at Wiltz did when the Red Army came through and the war stopped meaning anything where they were standing. They had no orders. They had no unit. There was no officer within 500 miles with the authority to tell them anything at all. So they treated the people in front of them. Russian casualties, Polish civilians, whoever came to the door in a countryside full of people with nowhere to go. And German prisoners of war. Sit with that for a second. These were men who had been driven east on foot in the winter, half-starved, some of whom had watched their own patients loaded onto open trucks in the cold because there was no other choice. Nobody would have said a word if they had walked west and never looked back. They stayed and they worked on Germans. Then they made their way home the long way round, some of them through Odessa on the Black Sea, because that was the only road out. There is nothing left to prove after that. It was never about supplies. It was never about policy. Take the supplies away, take the army away, take the war away, and those men did the same thing they had done in the tent at the crossroads. So let me tell you what happened to the rest of them. Henry Skoronsky, one of the enlisted medics from the crossroads, walked into Germany living on rutabagas and sugar beets and ended up at a camp at Mühlberg on thin soup and bread baked with sawdust with 5,000 other prisoners. He was still there when the Russians arrived in May. Most of the men taken with him spent the rest of the war behind wire, and most of them went on quietly, doing the only job they knew, on their fellow prisoners, with whatever they could beg or scrounge. Emile Natale, the technician who ran down that slope toward the burning trucks, came home as well. What he could not do at that crossroads, he carried for the rest of his life, and at some point he sat down and wrote it out, which is the only reason you heard those men at the start of this film. Willis McKee, the captain who drove into Bastogne on the afternoon of the 19th and asked permission to move his hospital and was told to go on back, came home. 40 years later, he sat down in Kentucky and recorded what he had seen, which is part of the reason we can tell you any of this at all. The record loses sight of Harry Fisher after the parachutes came down over Bastogne. That is the last clear image we have of him. An American surgeon standing on a hillside inside the German army, looking up at his own side's aircraft, calling it the most thrilling thing he had ever seen. Augusta Chiwi went home to a life in which almost nobody knew what she had done. It took more than 60 years for anyone to come looking. She was decorated by Belgium and by the United States, and she died in 2015, aged 94. Günther Stüttgen, who talked both sides into holding their fire at the Kahl Bridge, was honored after the war by the governor of Pennsylvania. And the plaque to Friedrich Lengfeld is still standing in the German cemetery at Hürtgen, where American veterans put it. Which leaves the man we began with. Charles Van Gorder got away. The Germans were moving prisoners, there was confusion on the road, and he took it. He and John Rada, the surgeon who had been on the same team, at the same table, at that crossroads, came out through Poland together and made it home. They were both headed for fellowships in New York. Big city medicine, the kind of career that D-Day and the Bulge and a German prison camp entitle a man to. Then Van Gorder went down to visit his family in Andrews, North Carolina, a small town in the mountains, sitting in a county that did not have a doctor worth the name. He never left. He got Rada to come with him. The two of them opened a tiny clinic on a corner in town, and for the rest of their working lives, they delivered the babies and set the bones and did the surgery for the whole valley. In time, they built the town its first hospital. Charles Van Gorder died on the 28th of November, 2002. Now, go back to where we started, 10:30 at night, the 19th of December, 1944. A crossroads in the woods northwest of Bastogne. Trucks burning. Red crosses lit up on canvas. An unarmed man walking toward an officer with a gun on his 32nd birthday, explaining in the man's own language that this is a hospital. And that is the answer to the question we started with. What the German doctors saw, standing next to these men in cellars and on hillsides, was not a better technique or a richer supply train. It was doctors who had never once been asked what a wounded man was worth. Their own country had asked them that question, and had answered it, years before the shooting began, in medical schools, and personnel files, and lists of people who were no longer welcome to practice. Every man they lost in a dressing room afterward was the bill for it. Charles Van Gorder was never asked the question, so he never had to stop being a doctor. Not at a crossroads in Belgium with a gun in his face, and not for the next 57 years in a small town in the mountains of North Carolina. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. Stories like this carry no famous names, and they only travel if the algorithm gets a little help. So, if it was worth your time, a like really does put it in front of someone whose father or grandfather was one of these men. Subscribe and hit the bell for more of them. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. If someone in your own family served, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, in any Allied uniform, tell me his name and what he did. I read them. That's how these men stay real.